In the aftermath of World War I, darkness festered in Germany. Seeds of hate planted decades earlier in the twisted soil of racial supremacy began to sprout. The Nazi Party, fueled by the charismatic but megalomaniacal Adolf Hitler, rose to power, promising a new German and Germanic utopia to be built on the backs of the inferior races. 1933, Hitler becomes Chancellor, and the SS, his guard, transforms from a ruthless paramilitary force into an instrument of state terror. One of the many branches of the SS is the now infamous Gestapo, but it will soon include the core members of the Totenkopfverbände, or Death's Head Formations, the men who ran and manned the concentration and extermination camp system. By 1935, anti-Jewish laws, known as the Nuremberg Laws for the city, which was in many ways the Nazis' spiritual home, had been passed. Jews were increasingly ostracized, and their rights were stripped away. On the night of November 9th, 1938, and into the morning of the 10th, anti-Jewish riots, known as Kristallnacht, for the mounds of broken glass from the windows and homes of both German Jewish citizens and foreign Jews living in Germany alike. The night of shattered glass, Kristallnacht, becomes a chilling symbol of what's to come. A twisted science, racial hygiene, becomes government policy and justifies the extermination of the unfit. The T4 program, a chilling precursor to the Holocaust, sees the disabled and mentally ill murdered in a horrifying display of Nazi eugenics or racial science, which categorized the most vulnerable segments of society as useless mouths. But the darkness doesn't end there. As the German army conquered other nations, especially in Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, more and more of what Hitler, Himmler, and most of the Nazi leadership considered inferior people fell under their control. The flames of hate lick higher, fueled by a horrifying vision. General Plan Ost, a plan to conquer and colonize Eastern Europe and Russia. These lands were to be purged of inferior races to create a living space for the Aryan master race. The Nazis weren't just about domination. It was about annihilation. Aryan supremacy ideology. Hitler did not begin racism and anti-Semitism in Germany and Austria, his birthplace. It had existed there for centuries. For centuries, the German people, including people in today's modern Germany and Austria and in the areas around them, found themselves at war with their neighbors and often each other. Through the centuries, the Germans frequently fought with two main ethnic groups, the French and the many Slavic people of Eastern Europe and Russia. Hatred on both sides was intense, and despite the economic and scientific wonders of the early 20th century, which brought unprecedented prosperity and relative peace to Europe, old hatreds die hard. By the late 1800s, scientific advances and discoveries led some to a new branch of study, eugenics. Though not all eugenicists were racists, many wanted to improve the health of all human society. In an age when Darwin's theory of evolution was still relatively new and advances in science were seemingly happening every day, some doctors, politicians, and thinkers developed the idea that the human race could be improved through selective breeding. At a time when DNA was not just not understood, but unknown. Some people, including many in positions of power, believed that restricting or prohibiting certain people from having children would eventually result in an improved human race. This meant that in some countries, including the USA, Australia, and Great Britain, certain people were involuntarily sterilized. The majority of them marginalized, either by racial discrimination, poverty, or both. In these places and in Germany, other scientists and politicians who, like many other white people in Western Europe and North America, lived in a time of rampant and pervasive racist ideas, from the subtle to the obvious and violent, began to see eugenics as a way to eliminate the non-white races of the world over time. Their ideas included mass sterilization, forced pregnancy by white men over generations, and, as you can probably guess, mass extermination. Hitler and the men around him were firm believers in the ideas of radical eugenics. Hitler comes to power. Throughout the Nazi rise to power, there had been violence, either physical or psychological, carried out by the Nazis on the Jews of Germany. The stormtroops, or Sturmabteilung, aka the SA, or the brown shirts, were the street bullies of the Nazi movement. Their job was to intimidate rival political parties, mostly the communists, and to bully, harass, beat, and sometimes kill Jews on the streets of Germany. When Hitler came to power, he allowed the SA to go on an anti-Semitic spree of demonstrations and staged riots in Jewish neighborhoods all over Germany. On April 1, 1933, a national boycott of Jewish businesses was called to protest what many Nazis believed was the Jews' domination of German economic life. They didn't. Jews were about 1% of the German population, and most Jews in Germany were not wealthy. But they made a convenient scapegoat, and the many Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, especially in Berlin and big cities like Hamburg and Frankfurt, with their very different cultures, ways of dress, and language, were easy targets. The boycott signaled that, at the very least, the Nazis' words were not just theoretical. The Nuremberg Laws. In September 1935, Hitler's government announced a new series of laws, collectively known as the Nuremberg Laws. By this time, there were already a number of laws on the books, both nationally and provincially, that had begun to regulate what Jews could and could not do in Germany, especially economically. But the Nuremberg Laws went much further. These laws established racial classifications and stripped Jews of their German citizenship. Marriages and intimate relationships between Jews and Germans were forbidden. The laws also restricted Jewish economic participation and public life. The Nuremberg Laws marked a significant turning point in Nazi Germany, as they created a legal framework for the persecution of Jews, which, among other things, normalized anti-Jewish behavior in the streets. Kristallnacht. To the evening of November 9th, 1938, into the morning of the 10th, the SA, SS, and the mobs they worked into a frenzy of hatred carried out an event so violent and sudden that, at the time, even people in other nations who had made excuses for Hitler were shocked. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, is the sadly poetic name for the anti-Jewish riots that took place throughout Germany, from large cities to small villages. Synagogues were burned, holy writings defaced, and, most memorably, the windows of thousands of Jewish shops and homes were broken. Jewish people who tried to stop it were beaten and sometimes killed. Nazi estimates of what they labeled as the manifestation of the German people's righteous anger towards the Jews was a little under 100. Most modern scholars put the number in the high hundreds, or perhaps more than 1,000. This figure includes some, though likely not all, of the deaths that took place as a result of beatings, and the many suicides that followed. One witness to the events of November 9th was 10-year-old Alfons Heck, who later went on to become a Hitler Youth leader and even shook Hitler's hand. After the war, and confronted by mountains of evidence and the stories of people he knew, Heck became a vocal opponent of Nazism and racial hatred. In later life, Heck was featured in a documentary called Confessions of a Hitler Youth. In it, he said, "Even to me as a 10-year-old, the events of the Kristallnacht, my witnessing the brutality committed on townspeople that I had known my whole life, signified the end of German innocence. From now on, not one of us could ever maintain that we did not know what was in store for the Jews." T4. Racial Hygiene. The events of Kristallnacht, the incessant anti-Jewish spoken, visual, written, and broadcast propaganda, created an environment in Germany that led Hitler, Himmler, and others to believe that it was time to begin other items on their agenda of racial purity. The T4 program, named for Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, the address of its headquarters, was the program that saw the Nazis move from street violence and intimidation of their opponents, not just the Jews, to outright murder. In 1933, the first concentration camp in Germany was opened at Dachau, near Munich, soon to be followed by dozens of others. In the 30s, opponents of the regime, real or imagined, were punished. Some were re-educated. Many were killed, but the majority of deaths came by the way of heavy beatings or neglect, not the open murder of the camps during the war. At the T4 institutions, mainly hospitals for the mentally and physically challenged, people were intentionally killed or sterilized. patients who had been in institutions for years, as well as children whose parents had recently had their children committed, either voluntarily or from pressure from the state, expected they would be cared for life. They didn't expect them to be gassed in the first gas chambers built by the Nazis, and which were disguised as shower rooms, or to be killed by lethal injection by their caregivers. But that's what happened. For a short time, after stories and eyewitness reports began to circulate through the country and influential church leaders spoke out against it, the program was halted by Hitler, only to be resumed again, in greater secrecy, as the war began. Mainstream historians estimate the total number of people killed in the T4 program to be over 200,000 and perhaps as high as 300,000. Franz Stangl, later commandant of the Treblinka and Sobibor extermination camps, began his career in murder in the T4 program, as did his superior Christian Wirth, a born sadist who was one of the principal architects of the Holocaust. Others also got their start in T4, including a number of infamous Nazi doctors who would later perpetrate disgusting and sadistic experiments on camp inmates during the Holocaust. Lebensborn. Even before the war began, the Nazis, specifically SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, started to put in place what later became known as the Lebensborn, or Spring of Life program. In Germany, the Lebensborn homes were places where unwed German mothers could come to have their children or place them for adoption to childless couples, or in some cases, officials of the Nazi state who wished to brag about their efforts in encouraging a new German master race, or Herrenvolk. Only women with pure German ancestry were admitted to the Lebensborn homes in Germany. Many of the women who had their children in Lebensborn were true believers who intentionally had children with SS men as a way of doing their duty as German mothers, their duty to Hitler and the German people. There were 10 Lebensborn homes in Germany. During the war, 9 Lebensborn homes were built in Norway, which was considered ideal for breeding and raising Germanic children. Denmark had 2, and France, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg had 1. Poland, where some of the most egregious crimes of the Nazis took place, had 6. The Nazis believed that in Poland and a few other places in Central and Eastern Europe, there were children with Aryan characteristics or even German heritage that could be valuable in Germany, as children to be raised as Germans by German families in Germany, or as breeding stock to create a race of blonde-haired, blue-eyed supermen and women. In the occupied territories, Lebensborn and units of the SS were on alert for women who had become pregnant by German soldiers, either voluntarily or by force, and for children with German physical characteristics. Hundreds of thousands of foreign children were forcibly taken from their homelands, and most were given to willing German families. Many of these children became forced laborers on farms, shops, and factories, and all were subjected to tremendous amounts of abuse. General Plan Ost. General Plan Ost, or East in German, was the Nazi plan for its post-war empire in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Throughout the early 20th century, right-wing German writers and politicians called for expanding the German state into what is now Poland, Russia, the Baltic states, and Ukraine. To Hitler and Himmler, these were vast, empty areas to be settled and improved by German farmer warriors who would rule over large numbers of slaves, meaning the people living there, the ones they didn't kill. General Plan Ost took many forms, and after the German defeat in Stalingrad in late 42, early 43, fewer and fewer resources were devoted to its implementation. Still, before that defeat, the Nazis were beginning to put their plan into action. One of the groups of people that were to be removed from conquered territories in the East was the Jews. The Roma and Sinti people, who were once known as gypsies, were also targets of Nazi racial hygiene and eliminated. Perhaps 500,000 or more Roma and Sinti people were killed in the extermination camps and killing fields of the Nazis. The other target of Hitler and the Nazis were the Slavic people of Europe, especially in Poland and the USSR. These people were to be killed. Those allowed to survive would be forced to work for German colonists or in Germany itself, as hundreds of thousands already were. The main points of General Plan Ost were the gaining of Lebensborn, or living space for the German people, the killing or enslavement of the population, or the forced removal of the population to Siberia, the settling of Germans into lands emptied of what Hitler called Germany's racial enemies, the exploitation of resources for use by Germany, the Holocaust, while having a bureaucratic machinery of its own, was also included in General Plan Ost, and was one of the most important to the Nazis. The expansion of the SS to rule over the vast lands that were to be taken for Germans to settle, the use of hunger as a weapon to weaken and eliminate the conquered populations, the use of sterilization to limit the number of those allowed to live and be worked to death by the Germans. General Plan Ost, in all of its forms, estimated that the number of people that would be killed through its policies would be upwards of 60 million people.